I'm Michael Appel for biznews.com. The topic for discussion in this podcast is corruption, something I touch on a lot. But my guest today has just released a report titled Sound the Alarm, Corruption in the Education Sector. Now, that's something I haven't focused on before, but it happens. It's pervasive. It's all over the headlines. Just one such example, 431 million rand spent by the Gauteng Education Department on sanitizing classrooms during a 3-month period in 2020. It works out to roughly 192,000 rand per classroom or building sanitized. Astounding. My guest, Melusi Ncala, is a senior researcher at Corruption Watch and the author of the report. Melusi, thanks for your time.
Hello, Michael, and thank you for having us on the podcast.
As a starting point, Corruption Watch has received 36,000 reports of corruption between 2012 and 2021. This sectoral report, you say, comes from 10% of those reported cases, representing about, over 3,600 tip-offs. Is that correct?
Yes, that is indeed correct. This is a sample of whistleblower accounts that we received during that period, and it primarily focuses on certain areas within the education sector. And by that we mean schools, in other words, that directly relates to the Department of Basic Education. And then, of course, there are TVET colleges, or Technical Vocational Education and Training colleges, as well as SETAs, which are Skills Education and Training Authority entities.
So these 3,600 plus reports, were they investigated and corroborated, or are these simply reports and tip-offs that came through to Corruption Watch?
These are all whistleblower accounts. Some of them we were investigated over the years. I'm thinking now particularly in relation to schools. In about 2015, we published a report titled Loss of Principle, in which we spoke about several investigations that were conducted. And the authorities at that time said they will definitely follow up on those issues and try to hold those who are implicated accountable.
Are there certain provinces where education corruption is more pervasive than others?
Yes, though we kind of reluctant to speak of it in terms of corruption being more pervasive because, as you know, we encourage members of the public to come forward to us and report incidents of corruption. That said, that does not mean that this particular region or this particular province is the most corrupt. But that said, Gauteng often finds itself topping the list of the most corruption reports that we receive, and that's followed by KwaZulu-Natal and in some instances Eastern Cape. When you think about the category of schools, for example, that's where those would be your top three.
Now, I noticed one of the main issues that whistleblowers raised was corruption in feeding schemes. Now, this is stealing potentially or allegedly directly out of the mouths of most vulnerable children in society. That's got to make your head spin. That's pretty awful.
It's very concerning. And the irony of this whole situation, now that you highlighted the NSNP, which is the National Schools Nutrition Program, is that on the one hand, officials will often lament the fact that there are not enough resources, yet these resources, on the other hand, are abused or misused or stolen. So when you have principals or teachers, administrators, at times even school governing body members, stealing food that is meant to feed children who fall under quintile 1 and 2 and 3 schools, that's very, very concerning. Because when we understand the context of the feeding scheme system in South Africa, it was an initiative that the late President Nelson Mandela actually started because of the extreme inequality and poverty found in the country, where some kids would go to school without having any food whatsoever. Now we've got people exploiting the system for their own use.
Yeah. It's very often the only meal that some children get is at school. I want to speak about sextortion as another terrible issue your report makes mention of, especially if it extends to minors potentially. Tell us about that.
So by sextortion, it's an area of corruption that is still being academically developed. It's extensively talked about, especially by Transparency International, to whom we are a member of. What happens is that you have people in authority, in powerful positions, soliciting sexual favors from either students, so that they can get higher marks in terms of their schooling. And in other ways, how it manifests itself is when people are applying for jobs or seeking promotions at their place of employment.
I see misappropriation makes up 45% of the corruption that your report looks at, followed by maladministration with 17.1%. For people watching or listening, what's the difference between those two?
Misappropriation of resources is a category of corruption in which we primarily look at issues of theft of funds, misuse of resources, and abuse of those resources, so vehicles, or perhaps you find that, teachers will maybe steal stationery and books for their own use. But it can be as small as that, supposedly, if that's how we want to look at corruption issues, and as big as millions of money being stolen by SGB members and principals. So that's what we're looking at there. In terms of maladministration, we're looking at issues of mismanagement of funds, and as well as wasteful and fruitless expenditure.
Let's get to sector education training authorities, so-called SETAs. Gauteng is a standout province here with 54% of the corruption. One aspect I picked up on was stipends. That's the little bit of money that disadvantaged students are supposed to live off on a monthly basis. Your report mentions they're either being shortchanged or they're getting nothing at all.
These are usually companies that are contracted to the government, left to administer these programs. So they're supposed to give people learnerships or at least internships so that they can get work experience. What then happens is that when people enroll to these programs, they're supposed to receive a stipend, because for those who understand the education context in South Africa, it's often the poorest of the poor who use education as a key to get other opportunities. Now, in these particular settings, it's either these companies do not give people what they're supposed to be getting, or that they agreed that they would give people, the applicants, or they don't receive it at all. And when they do complain, they get kicked out of the program.
Yeah. Technical vocational education and training colleges, TVET colleges. I see there was one instance of a person hired with multiple criminal records. This isn't new. This happens in the police itself. But you're finding that this is commonplace in TVET colleges?
I was important to highlight that because I was reading through some of these cases, and it really stood out for me. In that particular case, actually, what happened is that this particular administrator was allegedly had a criminal record, and they went on to employ their own friends as well. And it is also assumed that the friend also had some kind of record as well, or they weren't fit for purpose in terms of what was required at the TVET college. But further to that is that we also need to bear in mind that some of these TVET college allegations of corruption involve municipal officials, because they are often placed under the administration or under the direct control of municipalities, particularly the big metros. The city of Ekurhuleni, that's where that particular incident is said to have occurred, or maybe the capital. So it's very depressing, especially when you consider that procurement irregularities is a norm in that space as well, where people will pay kickbacks to be service providers, or at least officials will solicit those kickbacks, those bribes from them.
So where to from here? Where are you sending this report? I'm hoping it lands on the desk of the Basic Education Minister.
I know it sounds a bit cliche to say this, but I'm really perturbed. My colleagues and I are actually sick and tired of the status quo, because when you look at schools, for example, we've highlighted this incident of corruption to various authorities. They've promised to look into them. But the way I think of it is that they simply paid lip service to the issue because there has not been any consequence management. By that, what I mean is that they've got this rotational system where if a principal, for example, is implicated in corruption and is suspended, he or she will then be placed in another school. It just shows you how seriously or not seriously government takes the issue of accountability in as far as corrupt activities go. We have conducted SGB training in terms of financial literacy and anti-corruption, and we feel that it's important that the government makes it compulsory in institutions for that to be the case. But beyond that, I think it's high time that we, as the people, we stand together on this issue, and we'll be coming up with a plan of action to say that how do we up the ante, because surely we cannot continue this way.
Yeah, to your point about somebody accused of something, they place them on suspension, you bring in another person, you make them acting head of whatever. We have so many acting this, acting that, more actors than Hollywood. Melusi Ncala, pleasure chatting to you. Thank you for this report. Thanks for your time.